Our top story comes in on the Afghan conflict as the chief of the Australian Defence Force, Angus Campbell, has now made a shocking admission. Aussie troops unlawfully killed 39 Afghan civilians and non-combatants. The admission comes after the results were released of a 4-year investigation into allegations surrounding the behaviour of some Aussie soldiers. The soldiers involved belong to the Australian Special Air Service and Commando regiments stationed in Afghanistan from 2005 till 2016. Recommending prosecution on war crimes charges, General Angus Campbell has apologised to Afghans. Listen in to what he had to say.
I am sincerely sorry for their loss, and I can't imagine the pain, the suffering and the uncertainty that that loss has caused, both at the time and that continuing uncertainty of how this happened.
The Inspector General found there to be credible information to substantiate 23 incidents of alleged unlawful killing of 39 Afghans. 25 Australian Special Forces personnel are believed to be behind the crime. Some of those allegedly responsible are still serving in Australia's military. The killings would be referred to a soon-to-be-appointed special investigator to determine whether there was sufficient evidence to prosecute. The Aussie soldiers predominantly belonged to the Special Air Service Regiment. The Afghans killed by these Aussie soldiers were prisoners, farmers or simply other civilians in some cases. These Afghans were killed, quote-unquote, outside the heat of battle.
The killing, the unlawful killing of civilians and prisoners is never acceptable. It's my duty and that of my fellow chiefs to set things right. Accountability rests with those who allegedly broke the law and with the chain of command, responsible for the systemic failures involved.
Reacting to Australia's war crimes report, here's a first-person account of Abdul Manan, who was detained at least 6 times by Australian forces for allegedly helping the Taliban.
راکولی خوب ته بیا نه پریښول چې کله به زه پریشانۍ یوړلم دوی به ده ته بالله پر سر باندې ولم نه پراته ولاړو خوب ته یې نه پریښول بدخوابي یې راکوله. پوښتنه مو دا ده چې باید زموږ سره هغه ظلمونه سوي دي باید دوی محکمه کړه شي، دوی عدالت ته راکش کړه شي، دوی د افغانانو سره چې دغه ظلمونه سوي دي هغه باید دوی په خپله دغه سزا باندې ورسول شي.
Australia's admission comes after Prime Minister Morrison spoke with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani. Ghani's office later released a statement saying, and I quote, "The Prime Minister of Australia expressed his deepest sorrow over the misconduct by some Australian troops in Afghanistan." However, Scott Morrison's office did not mention that the Aussie Prime Minister has issued an apology. Instead, the release by Aussie Prime Minister's office states, and I quote again, "The Prime Minister called President Ghani yesterday to foreshadow the release of the report today, said the report contained some disturbing allegations and the Australian government was taking those allegations very seriously. President Ghani appreciated the direct contact, noted the many Australians who had served with distinction in Afghanistan and said he was counting on Australia's justice system to follow up on these matters." Let's quickly get in a sense of perspective on this inquiry's findings. For that, I'm joined in by our guest, Professor John Blaxland. He's a professor in intelligence studies and international security at the Australian National University and a former Australian Army officer. A very warm welcome to you, Professor. Thank you for joining us. Now, as a former Australian Army officer, what has been your reaction to the inquiry's findings?
Deep sorrow and regret. But what has happened certainly warrants the Chief of Defence Force's unreserved apology. There's no question about that. This is a stain on the reputation and legacy of the Australian Defence Force and on the nation of Australia. It speaks to a failure that is bigger and deeper than the soldiers involved in the atrocities. It speaks to an inadequate sense of perspective on what we were committing our forces to do and the circumstances that they would face.
Right.
But thankfully it also speaks to some positive aspects of our society. This kind of report would never see the light of day in a closed society. Australia, as an open liberal democracy, is right to address these issues with deliberation. The implications need to be considered very, very carefully, and responses need to be actioned mindful of the need to contain the damage to the capability inherent in the Defence Force. So the Chief of Defence Force is right to focus on the three critical areas he's mentioned: reforming the culture of the Special Operations Command, addressing shortcomings in command and governance arrangements, and holding individuals to account, individuals and collectively.
Right, fair enough. Some very good points made by you over there, Professor. Now, there are clearly two different versions coming from the Afghan Prime Minister and the Australian Prime Minister's office. While the Afghan Prime Minister claims that the Australian Prime Minister apologised, the statement from Scott Morrison's office indicates otherwise. What explains these two conflicting versions?
I think the difference here is that the Prime Minister was preempting the official announcement by the Chief of the Defence Force, General Angus Campbell. So he was not, he was telegraphing the message of apology, which was coming from General Campbell himself. So I think, I don't think we need to conflate the issues. It was a courtesy call to advise him that the announcement was coming. And I'm pretty sure President Ghani already knows this. He would have been briefed on this before. So this was about making sure that the diplomatic protocols were being followed appropriately. So it was not that I'm pretty sure that this is not about the Prime Minister of Australia refusing to apologise. It's simply a matter of him allowing that to happen at the hands of the Chief of the Defence Force, who is in command of the troops who undertook these atrocities. That's the key distinction.
Right. Also, the inquiry, the findings of this inquiry highlight a sort of warrior culture among some soldiers of the Australian Defence Force. What has been your experience?
Yes, look, what we think we see here is an erosion of the moral compass of a select number of soldiers, about 20 to 25 soldiers, who went on repeated deployments. And there's 5 known deployments between 2009 and 2013 where these particular identified Special Forces soldiers basically went rogue. They exercised powers and that they were not authorised to exercise. They exercised a very secretive manner of behaviour. They blackmailed their subordinates to keep quiet, and they had a trusted culture where their superiors, who were physically removed from them, didn't check on these actions specifically. And in part, so there's responsibility at the individual patrol commander and patrol soldier level, but there's a level of responsibility at the troop level, at the squadron level, and at the regimental level for what was happening, because this is about leadership.
Right, this is about leadership, and practices such as blooding, weapons and other items being planted near Afghan bodies to cover up these crimes. These are certainly practices which are not, of course, seen in day-to-day sort of behavior coming in from soldiers deployed in Afghanistan. Having said that, Professor, earlier this year, the International Criminal Court began investigating alleged war crimes by the United States and others in the Afghan conflict. Can the ICC play a role in these findings to bring the killers to justice? What's the way forward?
I think you'll find that the ICC will have already been in negotiations with Australia about the procedures to be followed. I expect that the ICC will accept Australia maintaining its jurisdiction over the proceedings on the basis that there's quite a high degree of transparency about the procedures. Now, the report that's been issued has a lot of redactions, but those are not to hide the material. They are to preserve the evidence for the judicial proceedings that are to follow. And so it's very important. It's been telegraphed. The message has been made very, very clear that the Australian government and the Australian Defence Force will prosecute this aberrant behaviour by these soldiers. And part of to make sure that they have the right of being treated as innocent until proven guilty, their names and the specific details that would incriminate them otherwise to a jury are withheld from public release for justifiable legal reasons. It's very important to make a distinction. This is not a cover-up. This is an expose, but it's an iterative one. There are steps to be taken. Right. This has been the report. There are now judicial proceedings that must follow, right. But there's some legal arrangements that have yet to fall into place.
Right. Well said. Thank you, Professor, for joining us on this newscast and bringing us your precious inputs.